Well, it's my pleasure to be with you today to present this topic. It's perhaps a different topic from most of the topics and presentations that I've given here at ITPMI as well as others. But I see we have a number of attendees, and I so hope that what we talk about today is of interest to you and answers some of the fundamental questions that you might have. So the topic of this presentation is Write Your PM Book Now, Tips and Techniques from Authors and Publishers. Some of what we're going to talk about today is what I've learned personally, but quite frankly, there's far more that I've learned from others, both authors and publishers. So I've amalgamated all of that into this presentation today. And like I said before with Susan, I've had numerous project managers, as well as PMO managers and others, but especially project managers, talk to me about their ideas for writing a book. And so this presentation, in many ways, is a repeat discussion that I've had one-on-one with many of those people. And I'm going to talk about some ideas at the end of this presentation in the event that you'd like to have a conversation along those lines. So the agenda I'd like to cover is as follows. First, why should you write your project management book? And that's a very good question that you might want to answer and think about. But as I've talked to project managers, it's really amazing in that some project managers think, yeah, I think I have a good idea for a book. But when we discuss it further, it's like, that's not a good idea. That's a great idea. We'll also know about tips and techniques from authors and publishers, personal lessons learned, and my three top tips for writing a book. I'll also provide some helpful resources for your first book. I wish I would have had these resources when I wrote my first book, because they're very, very valuable and most of them free. Also wrap up with common questions, such as how long does it take to write a book? What are some of the considerations, do's and don'ts, those kinds of things. And we'll have a summary of the presentation at the end, of course. So let's get started. Why should you write your project management book? Well, if you talk to or visit the sites of those that sell book writing services, they will say you should write your project management book because it will build a residual income. You'll get annually, if not semi-annually, royalty checks. And if you write a book or two or three, before you know it, you'll just have an income stream that just continues on and on and on. Also, they might advise that when you write your project management book, there's no greater way to develop a source of leads for your product or service. And in fact, this is the advice that many investment firms make to new companies that start out after their, let's say, angel round of financing and Series A and Series B rounds of financing. They say, if you're trying to capture the addressable market for a given product or service, the first thing you should do as part of your marketing strategy is to write the definitive book about how your product or services addresses the market better than anyone else's. And it becomes like a business card on steroids. These advocates also recommend, the people who provide book writing services advocate that a business book gives you instant credibility and authority and expertise to speak on a subject. And to some extent, that's true. There's many organizations that look to authors because they assume that they've taken the time to research their points of view, to organize them thoroughly, to publish them publicly, and thus if it's a topic that is pertinent, they make for very good speakers. And that leads to the next point. It can help you become not just a speaker, but a paid speaker, where you can launch webinars, workshops, podcast videos, and do other things that help with a revenue stream if that's what you're interested in. If you have a social media footprint, a book or two or three can help expand that social media footprint. If you're seeking to launch or refresh your company, whether it's a small company or just an individual sole proprietorship company, a notebook can be a way to do just that. And of course, it can help promote and monetize yourself over time. Now, that's what the people that provide book writing services say. But quite frankly, for my money's worth, and for those that I've spoken with, this really isn't why you should write your book. Um, and usually the people that write books for this reason, you see through it in the content of their book, and you probably won't even finish it. You'll just put it down as, well, this really isn't a well thought out book. This is just someone that's using a book to achieve an other aim. And so the writing tends to speak for itself based upon the motivation. But what others have shared with me and what I would say are as follows. Now, you might recognize some of these people: Lynn Atkins, Cornelius Fishner, Lisa Tutulio, Terry Dorsher, Jesse Fuel, Michelle Baca, Peter Taylor, and on and on and on. And perhaps one of my dear friends and colleagues that gives me untold grief in the lower right-hand corner, Andy Jordan. But what these people, what I would say is a good reason to write your project management book is to make a mark. If you have a particular passion or area of expertise, there's probably no better way to make a mark than to write a book, because just the mere fact of getting through the book and having it published, you will have indeed validated your thinking, validated your convictions, and made a mark of those convictions very publicly. For people that have had a lot of experience, especially that are maybe near retirement or semi-retired, writing a project management book is a great way to leave a legacy. I think of some of the senior project managers I've worked with that have years of experience, not just in project management, but they've seen industries come and go. They've seen technologies emerge and fade away. They've seen so many changes. So most people that have 25 years or 40 years of experience, my goodness, they have stories to tell. Another reason for writing a book is to prove them right. There may be more than one way to skin a cat, and yet there may be the best way to skin a cat. And oftentimes it's not the way that is taken. So writing a book can be a great way to call out, this is the right way to do it. Let me explain why, and let me validate it with my reasoning and the reasoning of others. Likewise, not just to prove them right, maybe to prove them wrong. Sometimes the momentum of an industry, of a practice, sometimes the momentum is in the wrong direction. And sometimes project manager professionals can see that early on and say, oh, we're going the wrong way. We need to turn the battleship. So getting out in front is a good way to shout up the pipe, as we call it. So sometimes a book is a great way to capture the attention and to correct the movement, whether it's an industry or a professional body or just even at the company level. Posterity, sometimes it's good to just write a book just for the posterity of it, to look back fondly or not so fondly, but to capture the posterity of all that you've been involved with as a project manager. And of course, you can write a book because you can. It's free therapy, and you might make money. So that's not something that I would leave off the list, but I just wouldn't put it at the top of the list. But I would say mostly the reason you might consider writing a book is because your story matters. And that comes across loud and clear to me, because in all the one-on-one private discussions I've had with people of all ages and of all levels of skill and different kinds of industries and company settings, when I talk to people and they share with me, this is the idea I have, this is the story I want to tell, my goodness, almost always it's a blockbuster kind of a story, and it matters. In fact, I'd probably even offer the corollary. If it didn't matter, you probably wouldn't be thinking about writing it. So the mere fact that you're thinking about writing on a given subject and creating a book almost is self-evident to the fact that that story indeed does matter. So what are some of the tips and techniques that authors typically say that I've worked with and talked to? And this is what I guess the authors in my circle all share with me. And it somewhat validates my thinking as well, in that there's a couple of categories in terms of approaches or key tips and techniques to think about as you get started. And these are the four that, there's many more, but these are the sort of the big four that jumped out in the discussions I've had with others that I was able to say, when it really comes down to it, this is what is really important as a tip and technique to think about and plan for in writing a book. First, stand for something. And usually that might be change. Just think of all the people who have written books about transitioning from plan-driven project management to the principles of complex adaptive systems or agile. There was a time I can remember when the prevailing sentiment was, well, project management is really a plan-driven scientific management activity, and some of these agile behaviors might be suitable for small, unimportant, short-term projects. But for the really important stuff, you need to pull out, Microsoft Project and really develop a really good dynamic schedule. And it really wasn't that long ago that people advocated for that. In fact, people even wrote books positioning when you should use project management, plan-driven techniques versus, agile kinds of things. And of course, a lot of people also stood up for something to suggest, well, hold on, not so fast. This agile approach to project management and embracing the principles of complex adaptive systems isn't just for small short-term projects. So standing for something, usually a change, is really important. And if I can share a personal story of mine, one of the things that I stood up for early on in the book series I wrote on business-driven PMO was I felt there was a need to stand up for something with respect to how PMOs were being set up. Now, bear in mind, nowadays in 2022, it's a much different story than it was in 1999 or the year 2000. But if I can ask you for some patience, when I came to the project management and PMO world in the 2000 timeframe, it was after 20 years of experience from 1980 to 2000 on the business side, where I was very much involved with projects and PMOs, but from a business person with accountability for business results. And I'd been in some PMOs, I had some PMOs that reported to me. And so I had a very clear idea of what the purpose of a PMO was. So when by pure accident, I got involved with the project management industry and started going to project management seminars and conferences and eventually was invited to give a presentation on the purpose of a PMO from a business person's perspective, I just felt there's a need to stand for something. And that something was the purpose of the PMO is not to establish processes for managing projects. It's not to implement a tool. It's not to staff an organization. So the people that thought the purpose of the PMO was to get your arms around people, processes, and tools are really misguided, because these things are not why you have a PMO. Those things are what a PMO might do. And so the purpose of the PMO, the ends to be achieved, really needs to be first established before anyone can start advocating means to the ends. People, process, and tools. In fact, I in my first slide, I remember over 20 years ago saying that the three words, people, process, and tools, are responsible for more PMO failures than any of the three words in the English language. So I was making a stand. I was saying, guys, stop rushing into PMO setup with a tool and process perspective. Take the time to first understand the business purpose for even having a PMO, and how's that purpose measured in terms of value, and how's that purpose codified in terms of how do we determine if we've achieved that purpose. And only until we establish the ends to be achieved can we then talk about means to the ends. And I was saying, in every other field of business, this is kind of basic, but the project management industry seems to have lost this. They just write into people, process, and tools, and let's throw in some PMP certification training. So at the time, now we think of it as just, it's so obvious, you wouldn't even challenge it. But at the time, I can remember that people say, you don't know what you're talking about. The purpose of the PMO is to produce reports. We're outputs, we're not outcomes. And it was even so controversial that at the time, I was even blackballed from presenting at PMI events because they thought I was anti-PMP or anti-project management, and nothing could be further from the truth. I was very pro project management and very pro everything that PMI advocated. It's just that I was more outcome oriented. And I was just suggesting that before you apply project management techniques, it's kind of important to know the context of the project so you apply the best techniques. And so it's just the difference between the way business people and project people think. So I had a real need to stand for something. Another category is established importance. That's the value. Oftentimes what you write about is going to deliver a perspective that establishes value. Another approach, tip and technique, is setting yourself apart. What makes your view, what makes you different than others, and sometimes that's important to draw out. Sometimes it's not important to draw out. Good example is I was talking to a senior project manager who said, "What makes me stand out is I've seen failures for the last 40 years, so I really know what failures look like." I can spot a project failure before anyone else can. And so let me show you all the warning signs. So he had this idea of writing a book about how to spot all the reasons where projects can go wrong. And of course, we all know there's lots of reasons where projects can go wrong, but think of someone who's had 40 years and is really good at it. Another tip and technique is writing with passion and conviction. That oftentimes, if you are able to write with passion and conviction, you come across as an evangelist. And that is the situation when one becomes an evangelist, that you're evangelizing others to come to your way of thinking. Sometimes people refer to preaching to the choir. That oftentimes an evangelist is saying things that people are able to hear and receive and want to discuss, think about further, and maybe even come to believe in. I think a good example of that is think of all the people that were evangelists for Agile in the early days that had to speak with passion to a wide variety of people up and down the organizational hierarchy, from executives all the way down to individual contributors. And sometimes in lack of any other compulsion, it was just a sheer evangelize and say, guys, we need to do this. Let's start an initiative. I can't prove it to you scientifically, but let's just start, So a lot of organizations found an evangelist to help start an initiative. And that can be also a tip and technique for writing, to write from the perspective, from the voice of an evangelist. So these are some of the things to think about as a potential author, whether it's first time or for a second or even multiple books. What is the stance that you think you'll be taking? Are you advocating change? Are you advocating value? Are you setting yourself apart into being unique? Or are you just being a evangelistic voice? Now, these are tips and techniques from the author's perspective. I'd also like to share with you tips and techniques from the publisher perspective. So of the publishers that I worked with, what they've shared with me in terms of what they would like to see from authors, and especially first-time authors, are four things in working with them. First, set realistic goals. You can't just say, I want to write a 500-page book about this business topic in 30 days. Or I want to write a book that's going to sell 1 million copies. Or I want to write a book that's going to change the way the practicing industry views this subject. So set realistic goals, because those realistic goals will be what's going to drive what and how you write. Secondly, be organized in your work. You can't just say, okay, this weekend I'm going to write for 20 hours. And then I'm not going to touch anything for the next 3 weeks. Or I'm going to write 4 hours a day. And then you just don't have the time, and it never happens because it's too ambitious. So be organized in your work. Make a reasonable plan. Whether on your own or with the assistance of others, it's not really too hard to plan out the approach for writing the book. And it's not just the time, it's the scope, and it's the other things considered. Also risk. You might write a book, and in the context of writing and research, you may find you change your mind about something. Or you might think something is even more important than you thought it was. So it needs to be more emphasized. And then communicate regularly. Now, these things, set realistic goals, be organized in your work, make a reasonable plan, communicate regularly. These things are in the project manager wheelhouse. So most project managers, this is your bread and butter. You do this inherently. And I like to share this story, and I so hope I'm not offending anybody. And if I do, I don't care. But I care that you're offended, but it doesn't bother me that I offended you. It bothers me that you might feel bad. I was working with a publisher. In fact, I'll even tell the name. So if you're upset, be upset with them, J. Ross Publishing. And they were talking to me about how they really like working with project managers because they're so easy to work with. And the person of the publisher company I was working with gave me the example how he had one new book initiative with a project manager and another new book with an agile developer, an agile person. And when I say agile person, I mean real agile person. So all the project managers that were project managers and then have sort of made the migration to become agile, project managers become agile. You're agile, but that's a different kind of agile. You're not quite the agile that was never a project manager, that hates project management, that wants to kill the PMO, that, once you get into discussion, you just kind of know who these people are. So anyway, the publisher told me that, when he has a book initiative with these agile kinds of people, so it's like pulling teeth to get information. It's like, we'll agree to do this, we'll agree to do that. None of the due dates are met. None of the communications are held. And it's kind of like the mentality, well, if you want to know what's going on, come to the daily stand-up. So it was almost comical the way he was describing the differences in working with first-time authors that had a project management background and those that didn't, whether agile or otherwise. And the publisher was saying how much he enjoyed working with people that have a project management background. It just made so many things so much easier. So if you're considering writing your project management book and you're a project manager, take heart that you may not realize it, but some of the most important skills and behaviors for a first-time author, you already have. Personal lessons learned that I'd like to share with you. First, let me share with you things that did not work well for many of the authors that I've collaborated with, but specifically for me. So this is more of a real personal lessons learned, as in my case. Things that didn't work well for me as a first-time author, not so much now, but as a first-time author, were agents. For most first-time authors, agents just won't even return your call. They don't want to work with you. Now, if you have a popularity index for whatever reason, you could think of like an ex-president of the United States, how easy it would be for that person to find an agent, or for somebody that might be going through a personal experience that is in the national discourse that makes for a compelling story. Then that might be something that an agent might be interested in you. But as a first-time author, when I reached out to agents, I kind of made my list. I followed the recommendation that I found from a website to identify 20 agents that were in your genre. And typically they request you to submit what they call an agent proposal. And in the proposal, don't make any mistake about it. There's no customer service orientation to these people. They basically say, submit your request. If we're interested, within 90 days, you'll hear back from us. If we're not interested, you won't hear back from us. And after you submit your request, there's no reason to call us back. So you kind of are left with the feeling that the agents probably won't even call you back unless there's something in it for them. And to no discredit to the agents, that's probably the way it ought to be, because otherwise everybody's just wasting their time. because agents really don't have the ability to take a first-time unknown author and do anything for them. What agents have the ability to do is to be a go-between. So if you have a huge market for a book and you have the person that's going to produce that book that's going to be instantly successful because of either who he is as a public figure or who the content of the book is aimed at, then the agent can be that go-between. But unless those two things are in place, the agent is of no value, to no discredit to what agents do. So as a first-time author, while it wouldn't hurt you to reach out to agents, I would just say that in my experience, and in the experience of other authors I've worked with, other first-time authors I've worked with, agents really can't do anything for you. Writing in Windows. What do I mean by that? Well, I obviously don't mean writing in Windows literally, as in sitting in a window and writing. I mean windows of time. Oftentimes people will say, well, I'm going to create a window of time. I'll try to do 1 hour before work. I'll try to do 45 minutes at lunch. And then when I get home, maybe I'll do another hour or maybe 2. And I'll try to stick to that as much as possible. And I'll try to also find maybe 15 minutes in between meetings. So if I don't have anything going on and I'm not too busy at work, maybe I'll just find little windows of time each and every day to try to advance the book. That doesn't work so much. Writing in windows, and especially what I'm kind of referring to is writing into small windows in a day. Usually what works best and what many authors, business authors, as well as other authors like Stephen King recommend is establish your writing time. And if you really want to write a book, usually you need to write each day. It's not something you can just say, okay, I really want to write a book. I'll write on Monday, and then next Tuesday I'll write some more. So usually if you've committed yourself to writing a book, establish some amount of time each day to write. So how much of that time should that be? Well, professional authors, like Stephen King is a good example. He has a very prescriptive approach down to how he sits, what he drinks, what he eats, how long he takes. But the window of his writing as a professional author is only 3 hours a day. He writes no more, no less. And there's a number of reasons for that. If you write more than that, in his opinion, you have a tendency to go down rabbit holes, or you might be on one of these writing streaks where, without even realizing it, you're writing 5 pages at a time, another 5 pages at a time, and you might produce a lot of page count, but it might not be the quality, or it may take you down a direction that you revisit the next day, and you end up saying, well, gosh, it was great, I was productive, that I wrote 35 pages, but 33 of these pages I just have to get rid of because it really just was a runaway thought, a rabbit hole, if you will. So, I mean, he has the strong recommendation that don't write too much per day. It's actually can be a bad thing, but do write some amount. And what is that amount? So for non-professional authors, business people that are trying to work it in, oftentimes, what I've seen is that window of time that seems to work is about 90 minutes to 2 hours. That if it's less than 90 minutes, you might not get through the sitting in your chair thinking and writing productivity time that you need. And if it's more than 2 hours, not that you couldn't do 3 like a Stephen King, just that you might not have it in your calendar to do. So I found that for me, a 2-hour writing block worked well for my first 2 books. After that, I actually shortened it to 90 minutes a day, but every day. In one of the books, based upon how I was working and what I was involved with, that window was in the morning. So I woke up early in the morning. I wrote my 2 hours before my day started. In another one of my books, it was in the evening after dinner. So after dinner, rather than doing my normal after dinner routine, I went to my home office and secluded myself and literally had 2 hours. At the end of those 2 hours, I stopped, took my hands off the keyboard and left my home office and returned to the real world. And I found that to be really good advice. Now, I did, in my first book, violate that rule in that there were several times, boy, I can remember it vividly, where I wrote much more than 2 hours. In fact, I remember one day in my first book when I was writing in the mornings, it was a holiday. It was one of those days where Monday is a holiday. And so I literally wrote for 10 hours with just periodic breaks for, lunch and that kind of stuff. And I just thought, wow, this is great. But then the next day, when I looked at what I wrote, you know, just exactly what Stephen King warned against, I quickly saw that even though I wrote about 45 pages, it was just too much. And it didn't really work. It didn't have the right balance. And it was too deep in terms of the page count for the topic relative to the other pages. And in hindsight, it was a waste of time. The other personal lessons learned was humor. The challenge with humor is it usually has a victim. And one way to get around that is to self-deprecate and have yourself be the object of the humor. But that sometimes needs to be done in limitation, because if you self-deprecate too much, even though you're using very good humor and it's really funny and you want to make yourself the object so you don't offend anyone else, if you make yourself the object of too much self-deprecating humor, it might come across as, well, why am I reading this guy? He's a jokester and everything has gone wrong against him. Maybe I should be reading from someone else. But more specifically, in terms of the victimhood, in my first book on business-driven PMO setup, one of the chapters that I thought was just great that everybody would love was a playful, humorous chapter on the top 10 things that the project management industry does to help businesses fail with their PMOs. And it kind of went through like the top 10 reasons that PMOs struggle on account of specifically things that the project management industry does. And it was done in kind of a satirical, joking way. But for every one of those 10 things, it was a very real thing. Kind of like what happens when you think the purpose of the PMO is to train and certify all the project managers. I mean, it's great for PMI, but is that really what a typical business PMO needs to do? I mean, does everybody that's involved in a project need to be certified? I mean, you might argue the project managers do, but do the team members do? And you get the idea. So the humor that even included little cartoon sketches, though very funny, it had a victim. And so fortunately, since I was working with the publisher just absolutely refused to have that chapter in the book and said, you just can't do this. I mean, the Project Management Institute is probably going to be a channel for your book. You're writing a book for project managers. They're the key advocate of the profession. You can't be mocking them or making them a victim of your humor. And you certainly don't want to self-deprecate, because that would be inappropriate as well. So in a business book setting, I found that humor usually doesn't work. It has a victim. So it needs to be touched upon in a very light way, and in a way that takes in consideration the fact that what might be humorous to one person might be offensive to someone else. And usually it doesn't advocate the premise or the points of the book. It's usually better to speak to the positive, speak more to the benefits or the aspects of the book that promote the story, and that extol the virtues of what you're writing, versus holding someone in harm. The other thing that I wanted to share in terms of things that did work, as opposed to the only things that didn't work, there are some things that did work well for me as a first-time author, as well as worked well for other authors that I've spoken with over the years that were first-time authors. And probably the first one is the publisher expertise and relationship. When you work with a publisher, we'll get to self-publishing in a moment, but when you work with a publisher, they bring so much to the table by way of their expertise, as well as their relationship with you. They can guide you through so many things. We just spoke to the humor issue. Another thing very simple that never even occurred to me, things like the actual physical dimension of your book. It's actually very important. Another thing, the total number of pages of your book. That's tremendously important for a business book. And it's not more pages is better. In fact, there are certain page ranges that if you have a range of, let's say 240 pages to 350 pages, that's a certain class of business book. If it's any less than that, it's not marketable. If it's any more than that, no matter what the story is, it's not marketable. And if it's more than that, it can't go from like 300 to 400. It needs to go like from 300 to 800, So there's all kinds of things like that that publishers know that I don't think there's any way for a first-time author to really know. Also, in terms of relationship, they're going to know the things that you inherently can do very well as a first-time author, as well as the things that give you challenges, and they can help you with those things. So the publisher expertise and relationship, I found as a first-time author was tremendously valuable, and I would never recommend. Well, let me take that back. You can certainly self-publish as a first-time author. And for a fiction book, that's a different genre, and that's a different set of pros and cons. But for a business book, I would highly recommend working with a publisher over self-publishing. The other thing that worked well was research. In the Business Driven PMO book series, I read or reread over 75 books on project management, office setup, and management. Now you'd be thinking, are there really that many books? Yeah, there are. There's a ton out there. Now this was over a decade ago. But what I found in doing the research was, oh my gosh, it validated my passion and conviction for the story that I wanted to tell. Because at the time, not now, but at the time, back then, almost all of the business books on PMO setup talked about, well, the most important thing is to get the PMO set up as quickly as possible and show results within 6 months, or else you'll lose support of the PMO. You need to make sure you get your processes and training done so people know the processes out there and how to follow it. You need to implement a good tool and do the training for the tool. And you need to train and certify your project managers and get people PMP certified and develop a program for them to go to the appropriate education. And it was like a playbook for putting the cart before the horse, and it just completely solidified and reinforced my thinking that not only do most businesses have problems in PMO setup because they put the cart before the horse, but the advice that's given out there does just that. I mean, literally out of 75 books, there was only 2 that talked about the need to establish, why do you even want to have a PMO in terms of outcomes, not outputs? So the research is tremendously valuable because it can validate your passion and it can challenge your passion. You might find that you're not the only person that has this way of thinking, and that people that have this way of thinking also have other ways of thinking that either complement or don't complement your perspective. So for a business book, research is tremendously important. It doesn't have to be exhaustive. It just has to be sufficient. Another key lesson learned, and this actually probably ought to be the top lesson learned, was case study contributors for a business book. So what do I mean by case study contributors? Let's say that you have a business book in mind, that you're advocating a particular theme or advocating a particular perspective. And in the course of organizing that perspective, you see 10 distinct chapters. So you might have your introduction to the book. You might have 10 distinct chapters that serve to advance the discussion that you want to put in print. And then you have a summary chapter that ties it all together. And this is that each of those 10 chapters are like standalone, brilliant blocks of information that you're bringing to the world. Just this great information that's going to make a big difference. Well, a case study contributor is someone that you invite to give a short business case study that reinforces the point of your chapter, that echoes the points you want to make, that validates your thinking. And you might have not one, but you might have 2 case study contributors at the end of the chapter. And not only does it validate the premise of your book. It gives color to the premise of your book. Another thing it does is, one of the comments that the publisher made to me was, no matter how good of a writer you are as a business writer, your reader will get used to your voice and may even get bored by it. And so when you have an outside guest contributor, you're providing a color, a different voice. And so in one of my first books, I decided, based upon the publisher's advice, to have 2 case study contributors for each chapter to provide that color, and to have a very consistent format, so that each case study would be basically the exact same number of pages, let's say 4 pages. Each case study would have the exact 4 things in terms of organization and structure of the case study. So there is a expectation that as the reader is reading the supporting case study, it's very well organized and thought, it's net, crisp, concise, and it advances the premise of the chapter. Another thing it does is it helps with the page count. Because if you're writing a book and you say, my goodness, I need to fall within this range of 240 to 350 pages, and I have this great 10 chapters, but each chapter seems to only be about 15 pages or maybe 20 pages, that gets me 200 pages, but that's my story. I mean, I don't want to write more because that's my story. There's no need to write more. Well, what a great way to solve that problem than to identify professionals that will, validate your message and then also help you get to the page count. So there's many ways for a first-time author to create a book and get to a very meaty rendition of telling the story and providing validation of that story and having it be the right body of work in terms of page count that the publisher knows is needed for it to be a commercial success. And then, of course, if you have 10 chapters and 20 case study, colleagues, professionals, well-respected people that validate your story, then that just makes it, in my opinion, all the more tested. That if you are advocating a story, you've written a book, and there's other professionals, whether it's 10, 20, 5, 15, that contribute and support that story, it just makes it a more complete and a deeper read. Another tip that worked out well was, at the end of each of your chapters, again, this is for a business book, have end of chapter questions and then provide an answer key to those questions that can be made available from the publisher's website. At the time, I didn't really understand how important that was. The publisher I worked with, J. Ross Publishing, insisted upon it. They said, these chapters are great. Now, have a end of chapter question list, like study questions, and then give us the answers. And I said, well, why would I do that? And why would anybody want to, take a test after you've written a book, after they've read a chapter? It's like, it was hard enough for me to make the time to read your chapter, read your book, and now I got to take a test too. Well, it turns out that there's a ton of people in the industry, educator industries, whether they're colleges or universities or trade schools, that look for business books that complement their subject that they teach. And I don't want to say that these professors are lazy, but these professors just love it if they're teaching a subject and they can have a book be part of the homework, because professors have to give homework that you read, and that they can actually give the students test questions, whether it's a informal answer these questions after you read this chapter, or whether it's a formal part of the test, and the professors are given the answers from the publisher. So that's a personal lesson learned for me, in that several educational institutions have picked up some all of my books, some 1 or 2 of the books, and kind of when I asked them why, after thanking them, of course, and being pleased by it and honored by it, the answer was all the same. They said, we love this book and we really like the end of chapter questions. It complements our curriculum. It fits the semester well, whether the semester is 10 or 12 weeks, each week, we give the students a study assignment to read your book, to read a chapter of your book and answer the questions. And so what did the professor do in all that? Nothing. So that's really a tip and technique that served me well And I think anybody writing a business book, especially in the project management space, think of all the people that teach project management, and not so much certification training, but the schools that teach like advanced master level courses in project management. They typically dump on the students all kinds of extra reading material. So I benefited from and saw the utility after the fact of the end of chapter questions. And that's a good example of something like the case study contributors that I never would have thought of as a first-time author. Another thing, and boy, was this a big personal lesson learned, is book writing software. What do I mean by book writing software? Well, there's all kinds of book writing software packages, and I'm going to show one in a moment, that are virtually free. They're so inexpensive. And I'll get into what those look like in a moment. So I don't want to talk too much about that right now, but just bear in mind that you don't have to write a book in Microsoft Word or a word processing package. There's other options and alternatives. Okay, my top 3 tips. First, the tip is, right from those authors like Stephen King and others, both writers of fiction and writers of nonfiction, is that create a time and routine for your writing and stick to it. And if you can't stick to it, then maybe the routine is wrong. So again, create a time and routine for your writing and stick to it. And don't be intimidated. It's not like you have to set aside 4 hours a day. Like I mentioned in one of my books, I just set aside 90 minutes a day, and it was fit like a glove. That was all I needed. And if you have more time than that, that's great. But don't think you need to spend more than 2 hours a day, and certainly not more than 3 hours a day. If Stephen King doesn't write more than 3 hours a day, then we probably shouldn't write more than 3 hours a day either. My second tip. This is kind of interesting. When you're proofreading, always change fonts and colors when you're proofreading. So if your book is written in Times Roman, change it to a different font type and color for proofreading. And when I mean proofreading, I don't mean only when you're done with your book and you're proofing it for errors, because usually you proofread continuously. So you might finish a chapter or even a part of a chapter or even just a couple of pages. It's surprising when you change the font and color, what happens. It changes the way your brain works. When you proofread in the same font and color as the font and color that you wrote, there can be mistakes that you will read through and not even spot. For example, using the preposition of, twice in a row, or using a word like the, twice in a row, or omitting them altogether. So you know what you had in mind when you wrote, and you know it's there in your mind. And when you proofread it, even though it's not there, you mentally see it. It's like your brain tricks you. Also, there's certain words that can be sounded the same but spelled differently, like two and two. I'm going to the bank. I'm going to the bank too. So T-O and T-O-O. You know what you intended when you wrote it. And so your brain is already locked. It's in your hippocampus or whatever that's called. So if you proofread in the same font and color as you wrote, you may miss it. But when you change that font and color, oh my gosh, and I can speak from firsthand experience, it's amazing what happens. First, you pick up typos and word omissions right away, but also the story reads differently because you're reading each word. You're not skipping over the words mentally, even though you think you're reading them. I could go on and on and on about this one. And this was a tip that I didn't learn until later in my writing. So in my first couple of books, I didn't know about this tip. And then in my last couple of books, I knew about and used this tip. And I can just tell you, it makes all the difference in the world. And my last tip, and I hate to keep citing from Stephen King, and the reason I cite from Stephen King is when I started writing business books, I viewed a lot of website type things, internet type things, where you go to an author's website and they might have a blog or a podcast on tips and techniques for writing. And so I listened to one of these authors who'd written 150 books, and he shared his approach. And I'm summarizing greatly for time purposes, but he basically said, as a first-time author, you should write your introductory chapter and have it be great, compelling, where the reader has to read chapter 2. Then write your ending chapter. It has to be compelling and wrap it up and just put it on a platter. So after you've got a great beginning chapter and a great ending chapter, then you write all your middle stuff and filler, and that you do as quickly as possible so you can get your book out. And this particular author had written 150 books, and so who am I to argue? I mean, he's been successful. And then I stumbled across Stephen King's videos, and of course he doesn't write business books, he writes fiction, but I'm just interested because I like reading Stephen King. And so, he basically said in one of his videos on planning for your book, he said, that advice about writing your first chapter first and your last chapter second and into all the middle stuff? He said, that's a bunch of crap. He said, the most important thing to do in writing your book is don't get in the way of the story. And his point was, you might think where the book is going day one, but as you start writing it and as you start validating your convictions by putting them into words, there's going to be some changes in what is important to you. And if you're too organized and too prescriptive in terms of writing the beginning and writing the end and writing all the filler stuff, that's exactly the way it's going to read. And you'll lose all of the benefit of what you're learning in terms of how you're creating and advancing and bringing to life your story. So tip number 3, without further ado, straight from Stephen King, get a really good chair. And this is the Lazy Boy Business Deluxe leather chair. It's expensive relative to chairs. You can go to Staples and get a pretty good gaming chair for $99 or even less. This chair costs $250, and it's the chair I'm sitting on. And I can tell you, it's worth it. When you sit in it, you are comfortable. You don't fidget. And when you're doing your 90 minutes or 2 hours a day writing, the last thing you want to have bothering you is sitting on a chair that's uncomfortable, that doesn't support your physical needs. So get a good chair. So get a good chair and don't let yourself get in the way of your story. Helpful resources for first-time authors. Like I mentioned before, publishers are a key resource for first-time authors. And there's many business publishers out there. I happen to have used J. Ross Publishing. And the link I show isn't necessarily for you to go there and look at it, though it's a nice page, but just to reflect that all publishers have on their website a well-written description of their publishing program. And the publishing program of these publishers is a godsend for first-time authors because it tells you all of the things that you need to think about. And of course, writing the book is only one thing that you need to think about. There's all kinds of other things that go into writing a book. I could do a whole presentation on those things, but just suffice it to say, their program really forces you to go through the thinking that makes you even ready to sit down and start writing your book. In addition to publishers, there's all kinds of internet-based advice that you can find out there, free as well as fee-based. Here's 2 examples. Make Your Copy Count has all types of how to write a business book suggestions. And for a first-time author, again, these types of sites are really, really helpful, and they validate what you're already thinking as well as provide to you a way to think about and plan for the things that you haven't thought about yet. Book writing software, I discussed that earlier. There's numerous free as well as fee-based writing software packages. And some of the fee-based ones are both a one-time fee, and it's your license forever and ever and ever. And then there's some that are monthly subscription-based, which I don't particularly like because as a author, my writing is so infrequently, I don't want to be paying anybody a month, even if it's only $1 or $2 or $3. I don't want to be making a monthly payment for this type of stuff. But let me just show you the Write It Now as an example. And just want to discuss in terms of as the first-time author, my experience. So the first book I wrote in Microsoft Word. And I know all of you know Microsoft Word. So you just start writing, and Word has some nice features. So you can do some headings, and you can do some paragraph formatting, and you can set the spacing that you would like. And so there's just, some things you can do within Word to kind of make it look pretty, but it's really an inappropriate platform to use for writing a book when you think of all the things that you're going to want to be able to do. So when I used Microsoft Word for my first book, I found it to be cumbersome, and I could find a way to work around to do a lot of things I wanted to do. But I stumbled across this book writing software called Write It Now. It only costs $59. And it's like many of the other packages for authors. And it really just addressed a lot of the things that I had problems with in Word. The idea of, wouldn't it be nice to know the word count, for your book in terms of by chapter or for in total, because it's really important to have a balance. I mean, if you're going to have a 10-chapter business book and you want each chapter to be roughly 18 to 20 pages, you can't have one that's 11 pages and another that's 36. Also, the organization of the book, the ability to have things like storyboards and editor outlines, and also the ability to list out ideas. And this is a very small snapshot, but suffice it to say, these writing software packages allow you to write your story. It organizes it in simple folder structures where you can have a very easy way to manage and navigate through your chapters. Also organize things like front and back matter of your book. Also organize things like if you had case study contributors, those things can be very easily organized and added to the book. Things like thesaurus, also in the writing, especially for fiction, but even for nonfiction, there's some things that sort of separate good writers from bad writers in terms of, are you always using the exact same nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs? So the ability to use maybe more robust language than you normally speak in. So I could go on and on and on about the features of these packages, but just suffice it to say, they're so cheap. I mean, if someone would have told me in my first writing book, you can do it in Microsoft Word, but here's all the limitations and things you can't do, or for $59, you're going to have this writing package, and it's going to organize all your thoughts and allow you to kind of have everything in one place, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. So I would just say that, if you're thinking about writing your book and you've kind of done the research and you're ready to start putting your ideas to paper or starting to put, sentences together, then I'd highly recommend getting one of these things because it really helps you with organization. It helps you with improvement of the body of work. It helps you identify things that you're going to want to make sure that you're doing well. And as you write, there's going to be other sites that you go to that give tips on what is good English, and what are some of the things that convention-wise you need to know if you don't know already. A good example was commas. How often do you use commas? And if you have several adjectives, do you have 2 or 3 commas? Or, the old classic question, do you put the comma before the and, or if there's an and, do you really need that comma? So there's a lot of conventions, and sometimes the answer isn't a matter of right or wrong, but, well, this is right in US English or American English, but this is right in British English, or this is right for newspaper, but this is right for a book, a printed book. And as you learn these things, then you want to be able to go through your writing and have a tool that helps you identify instances of where you might have used these things and want to clean it up. So I could say more and more and more, but just suffice it to say, if you're going to write a book, get one of these packages, and in addition to making your work better, it will make the process fun. So let's talk about some questions. How long does it take to write a book, a business book, if you're a first-time author? My experience and the experience of other first-time authors that I've worked with and know, and some of my friends, are very similar, and it's all 6 months on average. So if you've got the idea for a book and you're going to do 90 minutes or 2 hours a day, that you can put out a nice book if you have a 6-month perspective. If you try to do it in 5 months or 4 months, yes, you can do it, but you would be on the shorter end of that spectrum compared to others. And I would mention that 6 months is once you've started writing. That does not include any pre-writing research or learning that you choose to do. So many times someone might say, well, before I start writing, I need to do some research. I also need to bone up on my skills. I might want to discuss if I'm going to have case study contributors, who those people might be. So depending upon all of those parameters, your pre-writing research can vary anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. But once you start writing, you should feel confident that 6 months is a reasonable expectation to being done. And that's kind of important to have those expectations to communicate with yourself and others that have a need to know, because sometimes I've talked with people that want to write the book, or they have already started the process but stopped, and they got discouraged or it took too long. So and they said, well, I'd like to write a book, but I don't think if it takes me 2 years to write this, by the time the book is out, there'll be other books out on that subject and it won't be relevant anymore. It'll be yesterday's news, so why bother? So it's kind of important to have a view, so that if your topic and your passion and what you want to write about is time sensitive, you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to get your story out before that time sensitivity perishes. Should you work with a publisher or self-publisher? This, of course, depends upon your goals and needs. Now, mind you, for first-time authors, I always recommend work with a publisher just because they can be of such value and help to you. If you've already written books, or if you've written a lot of white papers, or if you don't think you have a need for a publisher, by all means, self-publishing has never been better than it is today. An example of that, when I wrote my first book, I did look at self-publishing, but back then you had to make an investment. So even though it was self-publishing, one of the self-publishers I liked, it kind of required you to put down a payment to work with them, and it was not trivial. I mean, it was thousands of dollars. And then once you work with them, they'll self-publish your book. So it wasn't totally free. Now, that was a long time ago. At present, there are self-publishing platforms like Amazon's Kindle Direct self-publishing that not only are free, but they have incredible, robust tools that help you publish your book, that give you what you need to translate your work into a finished manuscript, as well as designing covers, if it's a paperback or hard copy, or if it's an ebook, to design the digital cover. So not only is that all that free, but the platform to connect to your bank, the platform to monitor the sales of the units of the books, by book type, in terms of paperback, hardback, or ebook, and by location, Amazon US, Canada, all over the world. So all of those things are not only so much different now than they used to be, but they're free and you don't have to pay for them. Should you pay to have your book published? No, absolutely not. Excuse me. And beware of the scams. Regrettably, there's all kinds of scams out there. I had a colleague that a couple of years back, was a victim of one of those scams, and they start out small. It's like, well, for $50, we'll read your first chapter, and then for a little bit more money, we'll do this. And make a long story short, this guy ended up spending $9,000 with one of these publishers, obviously not all at once. They strung them out. And then once they get to the very end, okay, now we're ready to publish your book and we need this extra amount of money to get through our process. And to make a long story short, it was just a scam. And at the end of the day, it wasn't even a real company. And some of the real companies, that charge, aren't scams, but the nature of what they're offering, what you're paying for, is in effect a scam. So no, you don't have to pay to have your book published. The publisher do not charge you to publish your book. In fact, they pay you a royalty. And in the self-publishing, you don't have to pay to self-publish. They pay you a royalty for units sold. Is writing a book worth the effort? Absolutely. And I don't say this just from my experiences. Of all the folks I've worked with that have written a book, a business book, first-time authors, I've not met a single person, and I showed you pictures of some of these folks, good friends of mine earlier on, and many, many more. But I've not heard from anyone that says, "Boy, this is a waste of time. I wish I never did it." Um, so writing a book is definitely worth the effort. So in summary, we've talked about why you should write, how you should write. And one more thing I promise you is that if you do write your first business book, I promise you, you won't regret it. You'll learn a lot. You'll probably find ways to solidify that which you're passionate about and that's what you have convictions in, and it will take your expertise to a deeper level. And that's not only a level that reinforces what you think, but one that challenges. So you might find that, my goodness, I've thought about these 9 things, but there's a 10th thing that now I've really learned that's important too, and that I benefit from. So I promise you, if you take the time to write your business book, you won't regret it. But there's one more thing I should say, and that is, if the idea of writing a book is of interest to you and you'd like to have a chat, if you're a first-time author, you want to write a business book, I'd be delighted to chat with you further on a one-on-one basis to answer any questions you might have and discuss any of these tips and techniques further with you, especially because while publishers can help you with what they know, one thing a publisher doesn't know is, they understand the challenges that first-time authors have, but speaking first-time author to first-time author can give you additional views and insights and tips and techniques, as well as just temper what other advice may give you. So if anything that you've heard me say today is of interest and you'd like to have a personal chat to discuss this further, I'm at a place in my professional life that I would be delighted to make the time, and I have the time to make, to talk with you. There's nothing I like more than helping a first-time author get his book out. Perhaps the only thing I like more than helping them get it out is reading the finished book. So at this point in time, this concludes my part of the presentation, and I'd like to hand over the question and answer session off to Susan, who will field any questions that you might have. So Susan, over to you.
We do have some questions. One, you touched on a little bit about font size, but we have a question: is what font and point size do you recommend for a business book specifically?
That's a really good question. I don't have a particular recommendation, and I can't even tell you of the business books that I've written which it is. But what I can tell you is that's the type of thing that your publisher will have a strong opinion in. So for my books, I deferred to the publisher for font size and font type. In fact, let me open up. I have one of my books right here. I don't know what font is. It's definitely not Times Roman. It looks like it's about 10 pitch, but also in their packages that produce it, they sometimes talk in different things. Like, so what might be a size 10 to them as a size 1. So in answer to the question, it's a very good question. It's an important question, and it makes a difference. But as an author, if you're working with a publisher, that's a good example of something they handle for you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. We have a few people that are asking for a link to your presentation or a copy of your presentation. Can they email you for that, or what would be the best way to receive a copy? The best way is to
subscribe to the Great IT Professional and get it from your site, where I'm sure it will be up. But absolutely, if anybody would like this presentation, it's kind of high level and net, and I'm honored that you would like it. Feel free to send me an email directly, and I'll be glad to email the presentation PowerPoint, in the event that you want to change it or add to it, to you right away, if that's okay with you, because it's actually your presentation, Susan. But I'm happy to, if anybody has an interest, to send it to them.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you. We do appreciate that. So thanks. We have another question. Does a Write It Now tool format for ebook and print on demand publishing as compared to Amazon tools? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And in fact, I've written a book in Write It Now that I published on Amazon recently. And so the way Write It Now works is it will produce an export, and the export can be different formats. So if you're going to do a self-published book on Amazon Kindle Direct from Write It Now, you can publish in the format that they provide. And at Amazon Kindle's Direct end, they even have a tool that once you import your manuscript, whether it's from Write It Now or something else, you can then further add to the manuscript markup for such things as you might notice sometimes authors in the first word or first letter of a page of a chapter, that word might be 3 times the size in terms of font size as the others for artistic reasons. So those things can be done. So the answer to your question is absolutely. These packages like Write It Now and others provide an export of the manuscript, and there's different export types and different platforms for publishing, whether it's Amazon Kindle Direct or a publisher might use different export types. So that's a nice, again, reason why these packages are a step up and take into consideration things that you might not be thinking about had you written a book in Microsoft Word and then say, whoops, I imported my Microsoft Word file to Kindle Direct and the formatting is all messed up. So great question. And the answer is yes.
Big thanks to Mark for presenting with us today. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Susan, for having me.